So this is probably the most important video I've ever done. And really, if I can recommend you watch one, this is probably it. Because this is, I think this gets to the core of modern left-wing thought, why leftists and rightists can't understand each other. And I think this just kind of explains the entire modus operandi of the modern left. Now, you can agree or disagree with me, but I'm going to present lots of evidence. I'm going to present lots of logical arguments, ironically enough, in this. So without further ado, let's begin. So when Marx was drafting Communism, the issue he came up with when he was trying to rouse the working classes of the world to rise up against capitalism is he found a lot of the people weren't willing to. A lot of the lower classes and middle classes completely rejected his form of thinking to the point that many of them would eventually join fascist and other anti-communist groups to try and put communism down. Now, Marx couldn't understand this. He couldn't understand why the oppressed lower classes wouldn't rise up with him, why they wouldn't act in their self-interest. So what he kind of came up with was the idea that the people don't actually believe what they say they're going to believe. He said there is a number of thought processes and institutions that are implemented by the upper class, the capitalistic classes, the noble classes, just the power structure, have implemented these systems and these modes of thinking for the purpose of basically brainwashing the common people. So if a worker says he doesn't like communism because it's atheistic, it's because a priest has brainwashed him. Because the capitalist upper classes, in an attempt to fool the lower classes, have invented things like religion as a way to keep the plebs in line, as it were. If someone objects to communism because they say capitalism works better as an economic system, he'll say that's because the capitalist class is holding the promise or the carrot just out of reach that you can become wealthier. And there's a variety of other explanations that he came up with. At the core of all forms of false consciousness is I think very simply that the person who holds an opinion that's different than yours doesn't actually hold that opinion. It is caused by a spurious variable or a third party. So because you don't believe that they actually hold the opinion, what you do is you come up with something that could explain why they hold that opinion, and then you apply it to them. It starts from the assumption that they're wrong, and then you try to explain why they're wrong. It deliberately missteps the particulars of the certain person's situation. And oftentimes we'll see this, and I'll get into more specific examples. But people say to me, well, Argent, you're a racist because you were raised that way, when I wasn't, when I was raised in a liberal household. But they have to just come up with a external spurious explanation for why I hold the opinions I do on any number of issues, rather than actually engage me on any of my arguments. So we'll get into this more later, but I think this is very important to the psychology of the left, that by and large they can't accept that someone would legitimately hold a different opinion than them. It's not that the other person's wrong. It's not that the other person has different experiences and has come to a different conclusion. The other person isn't even wrong. They're under a delusion. They are mentally ill. They're projecting some personal insecurity. They've been brainwashed. They were raised a certain way. Their views are a reflection of personal interest, etc. So the whole idea is to prevent actually having any discussion. It's also to prevent people from even thinking that someone can legitimately oppose you. And you find this whenever you're debating a leftist, they'll just be like, wow, just wow. Or they'll be like, you're a hater. Or that's what Hitler said. Or just something like, you say that because you're insecure. They won't address your ideas. They won't address your rational facts. I think one of the best examples of this, ironically enough, is in Boondocks, where you have the trial of R. Kelly, where R. Kelly had peed on an underage girl. And at the trial of R. Kelly, the prosecutor was presenting like evidence, and he had like genetic testing. He had a video of it. He had like in the video, he goes, Yes, this is R. Kelly. Yes, the singer R. Kelly. My social security number is that he reads off his social security number. And the defense lawyer goes, I see all this evidence, I see all this genetic testing, I see this video, and I say racism. And then the jury acquits R. Kelly because none of the evidence actually matters. All that matters is they're prosecuting him because of racism. And you don't have to prove anything else. And that is really at the core of it. And most advances in modern left-wing thought, be it Freud, be it critical theory, be it gender theory, be it feminism, are all attempts to create new layers of things you can accuse people of false consciousness. And I'll get into each individual area in a minute. But for instance, you'll say, well, patriarchy is natural. Men and women are naturally different and they naturally have different social roles. And they'll say, well, Argent, you just believe that because you're a man. Well, I could believe it just because I'm a man, but that doesn't invalidate the rest of the arguments. There can be a number of causes for something. It's getting tunnel vision. So false consciousness is a kind of a composition of a number of different logical fallacies. One of them is circular reasoning. Now, Marxism is good because it is a completely closed system. Any aspect of Marxism that is challenged, Marxism has an innate way of defending itself. Every aspect of it supports every other aspect of it. If anyone challenges it, you can accuse your opponent of self-consciousness. The whole thing is not really empirical. It's this just idea of how history goes, and it's very generic and it's very broad. And it's framed in such a way that outside influence can't really attack it, largely because it denies the fact that anyone could legitimately disagree with it. And in the Soviet Union, this was taken to the point where people who disagreed with communism, they said, well, no one can actually disagree with communism because communism is perfect. So people who disagree are mentally ill. So the Soviet Union often would classify dissidents as having a disorder they invented called sluggish schizophrenia. And sluggish schizophrenia was a disorder that basically said you rejected communism. So people who were dissidents were pumped full of drugs and put into psychiatric institutions. And this is more or less how the left has always thought. They just took it to more of an extreme. So we have circular reasoning. We have the genetic fallacy. Now, the genetic fallacy has a number of different definitions of it. The one that I'm most fond of is the genetic fallacy is if you can offer a reasonable explanation for how the cause of something, that means it must be the cause and not just the cause, but the sole cause. And if you look at psychology, this is pretty much everything psychology does. It'll be like, oh, you're scared of women because you have a bad relationship with your mother. Well, that could be possible, but that's not the whole story. That could make sense. Or they'll say, well, you believe in God because you're projecting your need for a father figure. Okay, well, you may have a need for a father figure, but that doesn't change all the other variables involved. White privilege is kind of a recent example of this because it basically says any opinion that a white person has comes from the fact that they're a white person. And so there's no need to say, well, did that person come to this conclusion because of experience, because of thinking about it? Did it develop over time? No, it innately stems by that. And if you can basically wordsmith and use sophistry to construct what seems like a rational argument, then you just accept that without going further. As I said, and I must stress, there's often multiple reasons for things. People may become charity workers because with their specific skill set, they can actually create maybe a business that does charity work but also generates profit, but they also want to legitimately help people. These things aren't mutually exclusive. People may go to church because they enjoy the social and community aspects, but also because they really believe in it. These things are not mutually exclusive. People normally have a number of reasons for doing what they do. And to assume that there is only one aspect that drives everything else is a fallacy. There's also the aspect of arguing from motivation, which I talked about, that just saying whatever the person's motivation is the reason why they hold that view. So you accuse your opponent of wistful thinking. Another example of this is anyone who disagrees with global warming is paid by oil companies. Even if there's no evidence of that, because that sounds reasonable, that the oil companies would pay someone to act in their interest, it doesn't matter. The facts of the case are irrelevant. It doesn't matter what the person's actual position on oil companies are. If they even have any reason for that, it's just you're just inventing what may seem like a rational motive and applying it to someone. Then we have identity, where you say, let's see here in this case, white people are victims of police brutality just as often as black people. Newscaster, why would we believe a claim made by a racist? Which is kind of a form of ad hominem. Now, I think a lot of people misunderstand what ad hominem means. Ad hominem to me is bringing up something that is unrelated to the current topic. Something about the person that's unrelated. Now, not all appeals to things other than the topic itself are not permissible. There's lots of things that are. Like, let's say there's a scientist who's like, okay, I tested this drug is great, it's going to work. And this person has a history of falsifying information or just being really, really bad at doing that kind of research. If you bring up, I don't really trust you because directly relevant prior experience and directly relevant aspects of your character mean I shouldn't trust you, then that's not ad hominem. If you say, I don't want to leave this person around my kids because they've been convicted for child pornography, that's not ad hominem. You're attacking their character, but that's directly relevant to the situation. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Like, ad hominem would be if you were explaining something about economics or something, and you're like, well, this is how supply-demand curves work, and they're like, well, you wet your bed when you were younger. And you're just attempting to ridicule the person. That is an ad hominem attack. So, probably the person to first kind of fully realize the different layers of false consciousness was, interestingly enough, C.S. Lewis, who invented a term called Bulverism, which was a logical fallacy that basically combined the genetic fallacy, Marxian false consciousness, circular reasoning, and ad hominem together. And he viewed it as being the most common logical fallacy of modern times, to which he is completely right about. So let's just read some of his quotes on the matter. You must show that a man is wrong before you start explaining why he is wrong. The modern method is to assume without discussion that he is wrong and then distract his attention from this, the only real issue, by busily explaining how he became so silly. So I recently had an argument with someone, and they said, you're a racist and you're evil. And like, well, could you explain to me why that's bad? And he goes, I don't need to explain. Racism's just evil. Race realism is just evil, and I don't need to establish this. And then I explained my views on it. I talked about any number of historical cases I could cite about the negative outcomes of diversity. I talked about my support for nationalist movements elsewhere. I went through like all this stuff, and he said, you're just trying to justify your hatred of minorities. And I said, well, you're just accusing me of false consciousness. And he's like, yes, I am. But there's no way you could legitimately hold those positions outside of hate. So they won't even acknowledge your arguments. They will just attack you based on that. And it's important to note, these people don't know anything about me. They don't know anything about my past. They don't know how I came to my views. They just have a generic set of things they accuse people for to try to guilt them or to delegitimize them. Let's see here. So some other stuff he said. An example of this, who had maintained that both sides of a triangle were greater than the third, and he said, oh, you say that because you are a man. At that moment, they flashed the great truth that refutation is no necessary part of argument. Assume your opponent is wrong and explain his error, and the world will be at your feet. Attempt to prove that he is wrong, or worse still, try to find out whether he is right or wrong or right, and the national dynamism of our age will thrust you to the wall. That is how Bolivar became one of the makers of the 20th century. So another example of these is wistful thinking, which is a lot of it is also anti-realism, the idea that thoughts create reality and the denial of objective reality. So like one of these is, oh, you just see the color red because that's the subjective way your eyes work. But it ignores the fact that people see red because of a certain shift in the light. Colors reflect light in a certain way, and this is provable without a recourse to how your vision works. But they won't acknowledge that. They'll just come up with some sort of explanation. So let's just go through a couple other ones, a couple other examples of this he has. So we have appeal to profession, where if someone explains something, they go, well, you're just doing that to justify your position. Or you're just doing that because you have wistful thinking. Or you're doing that because you're evil. Or you're mentally ill, etc. And it's just bringing up a single issue that sounds probable, attributing it to the person. But the main basis of it is to delegitimize the person so you don't have to listen to their arguments. Because if you have to listen to other people's arguments and you have to try to justify your positions, it's more difficult, and you're going to have to acknowledge nuance, and you're going to have to acknowledge in a lot of cases that your opponents have a point. And if you notice, the left will never do that. Whenever I try to have a debate with them, and I frequently ask them to explain themselves, not because I think I can convince them, but I've just been doing testing for a long time on my channel as to how their psychology kind of works. And you're saying, well, Argent, that is a form of false consciousness. And there's a difference between assuming motive and judging actions. Those are two very different things. So what I was more testing was, what is their modus operandi? How do they argue on an average basis? Which I think you can say, because you can define any number of ways that people act and how they tend to perceive the world. As to why they believe what they believe, that's not really relevant. When I talk about status signaling, I don't think it necessarily I'm saying that their left-wing views come from pride. I'm not even really saying it comes from socialization. I think the way they behave has a lot of environmental functions, and it also has a lot of psychological functions. But what I take from that is largely what they themselves say, and the way in which they present themselves to the public. I think you can judge actions. I think you can judge what people say about themselves. But you have to actually look at the specific circumstance or the general circumstance and actually provide real arguments from it, as opposed to just blanketly dismissing your opponent and without really going into any detail about it. Like if you look at Obama's life, for instance, you can see any number of formative influences. You can say, well, part of why Obama's a leftist is because his mother was left-wing. There is, what's his name? That communist guy who partially raised him. He went to a left-wing law school. He was a community organizer. The rhetoric he uses is left-wing. He's the member of a left-wing party. I mean, these are all like direct actions he's done that you're judging him based on. It's not like you're just attributing something that has no relevance to him. You could say like this serial killer is partially a serial killer. It's also whether or not you attribute a motive as being the sole motive. You could say, well, a serial killer is partially a serial killer because he's psychotic, he's schizophrenic, and you can test schizophrenia. Like you can say, okay, well, under observation, he clearly sees things that aren't there. He has strange thought patterns. We did a scan of his brain, and we find a number of anomalies. So we did that. We also have lots of records and prior empirical evidence that schizophrenia in the particular form he has makes it more likely for him to be a mass murderer. Now, that doesn't preclude the fact that he's just an evil person. It doesn't preclude the fact that there's some other unrelated reason that he does what he does. But to say that's one of the causes, I think, is reasonable if you've done the actual background work and you actually have like empirical and logical arguments that apply to the specific circumstance or the specific set of circumstances to back it up. I think there's also, you have to acknowledge the nature of your discipline. I'm a social scientist, and I freely acknowledge that social science is not exhaustive. It's not like a physical science. You can't just look at an atom and go, okay, this is helium, this is hydrogen, this is one proton, one neutron. And you can physically observe that, you can verify it in a lab. And that is like 100% pretty much objective. Whereas once you get into social science, it's a mixture of different things. You're trying to come up with rational heuristics that kind of allow you to make predictions and to judge things based on collecting a lot of data and comparing it to similar circumstances. We don't pretend to know everything. We don't pretend to know anything for certain, nor do like early political scientists like Machiavelli pretend to know everything for certain. It's just general observation combined with a lot of data that produces a fairly reliable set of observations that you can apply in different circumstances. You also, then you kind of get into the softer things that aren't really even a science, which is like psychology. Psychology is a mixed bag because there's kind of a difference between, I'd say, like biological psychology, where you look at chemical imbalances, brain chemistry, inherited disorders, and just kind of more general stuff where you try to... The point of psychology, which I think people forget about, is to make people functional. To make it so they can live their lives and they can be relatively happy. Whether you know the exact causes or all the causes is kind of irrelevant. What you're trying to do is you're trying to use a combination of art and science to just get the person functional again. It's a very subjective field. It's not really a scientific field per se. There are reliable general categories and general diagnoses, which I agree with because there's lots of evidence to support that. But these things are not as solid, they're not as 100% as physical science. Like if someone has cancer, you can test it and say, okay, this is obviously a cancer cell. This is the part of body they're infecting. This is how it's killing the person. Whereas if a person's depressed, you don't know why they're depressed. You can give them some therapy that, generally speaking, will alleviate their depression. You can maybe try to find something that reasonably would cause the depression. Preferably something that the person themselves believes is the cause of their depression, which might be part of the cause. It likely is part of the cause. But your goal there is to get them to overcome their personal issues and to move on with their lives. So I hope that kind of explains the concept of false consciousness, the genetic fallacy, circular reasoning, Marxism, etc. And when you're dealing with people on the left, it's extremely important to understand that. I can't stress that enough. They will not acknowledge you have a point. They will not even debate with you. All they will do is try to ridicule you, call you mentally ill. They will, generally speaking, not engage with you. And I think that's part of the reason what's led us to this kind of the point we're at, where left and right just can't even talk to one another. Because while there is some accusations of false consciousness on the right, it's not universal in the way it is on the left. I mean, you might find like one or two exceptions that prove the rule. I don't deny that. But generally speaking, I think if you look at it and you just keep your eyes open and you observe the way the left argues in all sources, I think you have to, or are likely to come to the same conclusion that I have about the way they operate. So you consider this part one, or you can consider this just the explanation of false consciousness. I'm going to do another video going into specific instances of it as a way to kind of make it more practical. So I will put up this video, then I'll put up part two, and then I'll put it up as a combined video. And I just like to do that because some people don't want to watch two separate parts, which I don't, but I want to make this is 25 minutes. So let's try to keep this one half as short as possible. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you later.